The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October. I know the exact time because I'd been awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold 2 hours earlier, grading undergraduate papers on urban infrastructure policy. I know the exact time because I checked the clock on the microwave when the phone rang. A reflex, the way you check a clock when something breaks the silence of a late house. I know the exact time because I have replayed that moment more than any other moment in my life, and the green digits on the microwave have become, in memory, the dividing line between everything before and everything after. The number was Diane's. My wife's number. Help me. Her voice was fractured in a way I had never heard. Not crying, not panicked, but compressed, the way a voice sounds when the body is trying to produce sound under conditions that don't permit it. Marcus, please, I don't know where I am, someone. And then the call ended. I called back 11 times in the next 4 minutes. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. The cheerful automated prompt of a phone going unanswered while I stood in my kitchen with my heart, doing something that hearts aren't supposed to do, and my tea cold on the table, and the undergraduate papers fanned across the surface like evidence of a life that had, 47 seconds ago, become entirely irrelevant. I called 911 at 11:52 p.m. My name is Marcus. I'm 38 years old, and I teach urban policy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I have been married to Diane Reyes-Cole for 6 years. We have a daughter, Lily, who is 4, and we live in a row house in Capitol Hill that we bought 3 years ago, and that Diane decorated with the careful, layered attention of a woman who understood that a home was a form of argument about who you were, what you valued, what you were building. She was a graphic designer with her own small studio. She was precise and warm and occasionally difficult in the specific way of people who have high standards and know it. She was, I believe, mine, by which I mean not ownership, but the particular belonging of two people who have chosen each other in the ongoing, daily way that marriage requires. The detective who arrived at my door at 12:31 a.m. was named Sandra, mid-40s, compact, with the practice calm of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer requires preparation. She sat across from me at the kitchen table where the undergraduate papers still lay and asked me questions in the methodical sequence of someone building a structure from the ground up. Last known location. Last contact before the call. Any unusual behavior in recent days. Any known threats or conflicts. I answered everything I could. My voice was steady in the way that voices are sometimes steady in acute crisis. Not calm, but past the point where emotion has traction, operating on something more fundamental than feeling. We're going to find her, Detective Okafor said. She was right. They found Diane 72 hours later. What they found, and where they found her, and what finding her revealed about the 3 days I spent believing my wife had been taken. This is the story I have been trying to tell myself in the right order ever since. Because the order matters. Because the version of events I assembled in those 72 hours, built from fear and love and the willingness to believe the worst had happened to someone I needed to protect, was not wrong exactly. It was simply pointing in the wrong direction. My wife had been taken, just not the way I thought. The opening of Marcus's story is constructed around a single devastating irony. The frantic, terrified husband calling 911 to report his wife's abduction is, in fact, reporting a crime that does not exist in the form he believes it does. His fear is entirely real. His love is entirely real. His 72 hours of anguish are entirely real. And yet the premise on which all of it is built, that Diane is a victim, is false. This irony defines the psychological architecture of the entire narrative. Marcus is not a fool or a negligent husband. He is a man operating with incomplete information in a situation designed to exploit his deepest protective instincts. The phone call, fractured voice, abrupt disconnection, 11 unanswered callbacks, is engineered to produce exactly the response it produces: total mobilization of love and terror. It works because it is designed by someone who knows him. Detective Okafor's arrival introduces the institutional dimension of the deception. By involving law enforcement, Diane has not merely deceived her husband. She has deceived the state, deployed public resources, and created a legal situation whose consequences will extend far beyond the personal. This escalation is significant. It suggests either that Diane did not fully think through the ramifications of her plan, or that she did and considered them acceptable. Neither possibility reflects well on the architecture of her thinking. The final lines, "My wife had been taken, just not the way I thought," function as both resolution of the hook and deepening of the mystery. The audience understands that the abduction narrative is false before Marcus does, and this dramatic irony transforms the story from a thriller into something more psychologically complex. A portrait of a man discovering that the person he trusted most has built a parallel world inside the one they shared. I need to go back to before the phone call, because the phone call did not come from nowhere, even though it arrived that way. Diane and I had met in the way that academic-adjacent people often meet, through the connective tissue of mutual friends, at a dinner party in Adams Morgan 7 years ago where I'd arrived late, and she'd been the person who handed me a glass of wine without being asked and said, "You look like you drove through traffic for 40 minutes to get here." I had. She'd laughed at my expression, and I'd spent the rest of the evening making sure I was near enough to that laugh to hear it when it happened. We married after 2 years. Lily arrived in year 3. The row house in Capitol Hill in year 4. The surface of our life was, by any conventional measure, good. 2 careers that worked, a child who was healthy and luminous, a neighborhood we loved, friends we saw regularly. The ordinary, reliable texture of a life being built in the intended direction. Below the surface, I understand now, was a different story. But understanding that now is different from seeing it then, and I want to be honest about the seeing. The first thing I noticed and actually registered, as distinct from noticed and filed, was in late August, 6 weeks before the phone call. Diane had started running. This is not, on its face, a suspicious behavior. Many people start running. Diane had, in fact, tried running twice before in our relationship, once before Lily, once after, and abandoned it both times within a month. She found it boring, she said. She preferred yoga, swimming, movement that had shape and sequence. Running, she told me once, was just controlled falling. But in August, she started running 3 mornings a week, early, before Lily woke up. She bought proper shoes, a GPS watch, a belt for her phone. She downloaded an app and tracked her routes with the specificity of someone who had transitioned from trying something to committing to something. I was pleased for her. I mentioned the transformation and she shrugged it off in the way she sometimes dismissed compliments. A half smile, a redirect, moving to something else. What I didn't know then was that the running routes, when I would eventually see them, 3 months later, in a detective's office, on a printed map, were not random. 3 mornings a week, Diane ran the same loop, down East Capitol Street, across Lincoln Park, along Constitution Avenue, and back. The loop passed, at its midpoint, a coffee shop on Pennsylvania Avenue called Meridian. Marcus Webb, the name I didn't know yet, had an office 2 blocks from Meridian. The routes weren't exercise. They were proximity. And the GPS watch she'd been so careful about was recording them faithfully, because she was a designer, and designers think about documentation, and she had not yet thought through every implication of the technology she was using to map her mornings. The second signal was her phone. I want to be precise here, because the phone is something I've examined from every angle in the months since, looking for the place where I should have seen it and didn't. Diane had always been private with her phone. Not secretively so, but in the natural way of a person who runs a business, manages client relationships, and finds it slightly rude when people treat their phones as public objects in shared spaces. She left it face down sometimes. She didn't share it casually. What changed in September was the texture of her phone habits rather than the fact of them. She took it to the bathroom. She took it upstairs when she went to put Lily to bed and didn't come back down for 45 minutes, which I attributed to Lily's current phase of elaborate bedtime resistance negotiation. She answered calls in the kitchen while I was in the study, and when I came through she finished her sentences in a different register, slightly higher, slightly faster, and transitioned to asking me about dinner or Lily's preschool without a pause that would invite questions. I noticed. I stored. I did not connect. The third signal was a trip. In mid-September, Diane told me she had a client project requiring a site visit, a branding package for a hospitality company opening a boutique hotel in Charlottesville. 2 nights, Wednesday and Thursday. She showed me the project brief, which was real. I saw it, a genuine document with a genuine client name, the kind of professional collateral that is hard to fabricate quickly and which I therefore did not scrutinize. I drove Lily to preschool the 2 mornings Diane was away. I made pasta both nights. I called Diane at 9 p.m. on Wednesday, and she answered on the third ring and sounded relaxed, said the client dinner had gone well, asked about Lily. On Thursday morning, she texted me a photo of the hotel lobby. High ceilings, exposed brick, the kind of design that justifies the project brief she'd shown me. I have since looked up that hotel. It opened in Charlottesville, as described, in November. The branding project was real. Diane was in Charlottesville for approximately 4 hours. The remaining 32 hours of her 2-night absence, according to credit card records obtained later, were spent at a different hotel, a small inn in the Shenandoah Valley, 40 minutes from Charlottesville, with a restaurant that charged $340 for a dinner for two on a Wednesday evening in September. A dinner for two. I need to sit with that detail, even now. 40 minutes from where she'd told me she was, a $340 dinner for two, while I was making pasta in Capitol Hill, and Lily was asleep, and I had called at 9 p.m., and she'd answered on the third ring and sounded relaxed. The thing about the third ring is that I remember it. I remember thinking, at the time, that she'd been a moment away from sending me to voicemail. It crossed my mind, and then left my mind because I had no reason to hold it. I had a framework for understanding my marriage that made the 3-ring hesitation a small thing. She'd probably been in the middle of a sentence with the client, or washing her face, or reading. I had a framework, and it was wrong, and it cost me 32 hours and a $340 dinner that I didn't know about until the framework was already in ruins. There is one more signal, and it is the one I find hardest to tell. 4 days before the phone call, Diane and I had a conversation after Lily went to bed, sitting on the couch, the television off, the particular quality of light in our living room at 9 o'clock on a fall evening, orange and close. She asked me, with the precision she brought to things she'd been thinking about for a long time, whether I was happy. I said yes. I meant it. Are you happy with us? She said. With this? She gestured slightly at the room. I looked at her. Are you asking because you're not? I said. A pause. I'm asking because I want to know. I'm happy, I said. I don't need it to be different. She nodded and didn't say anything more, and we watched television for an hour and went to bed, and I thought, she's going through something. She'll tell me when she's ready. Give her space, and she'll come to it. This was my standard operating procedure for Diane's interior processing. She worked things out internally before she brought them out, and the space I gave her was a form of respect I developed over 6 years. It was also, I understand now, the last door she opened before she stopped opening doors altogether. At this stage, the story becomes a study in contrasts, between the polished surface of Marcus and Diane's life and the hidden tensions beneath it, between what Marcus notices and what he chooses to believe, and between the marriage he thinks he is living in and the one Diane is already preparing to leave. The running routes are perhaps the most structurally elegant element of the deception, and its most revealing flaw. Diane is a designer, someone who thinks in systems and visual logic, and her decision to use physical exercise as cover for proximity to her lover is sophisticated. But the GPS watch, bought with the same designer's attention to detail that characterizes everything she does, records what she is trying to conceal. The technology she uses to make the cover story more convincing is simultaneously the technology that will eventually expose it. This is the recurring irony of modern deception. The tools of documentation are always double-edged. The Charlottesville trip is constructed with the care of someone who has thought carefully about verification. The real client, the real project brief, the real hotel lobby photographed and texted. These are the scaffolding of a deception that has been engineered to withstand casual scrutiny. Marcus is not a suspicious man by nature, and Diane knows this. She has built the lie to the specifications of his trust, which makes it both more effective and, in retrospect, more painful. She has used her knowledge of him as a tool against him. The couch conversation 4 days before the phone call is the story's most significant missed turn. Diane is, in that moment, genuinely asking, offering, in the oblique language of someone who cannot yet say the direct thing, an opportunity for Marcus to open a conversation that might have changed the trajectory of what follows. His answer, "I'm happy, I don't need it to be different," is true and also precisely the wrong thing to say to someone who is unhappy and needs it to be different. The gap between his reality and hers is at its most visible in that exchange, and neither of them can see across it. The 72 hours after the phone call were the most structurally disorienting experience of my life. I want to explain what I mean by that, because it is not simply that they were the most painful, though they were, or the most frightening, though they were. I mean that the fundamental cognitive framework by which I organized reality became, for those 72 hours, unreliable in a way it had never been before. Every assumption about the world, that cause preceded effect, that context was stable, that the people I knew were who I believed them to be, required constant re-examination in the light of a situation that refused to hold still. Detective Okafor worked the case with a focused, methodical efficiency that I found, in my terror, genuinely comforting. She was not warm in the conventional sense. She did not offer reassurances she couldn't verify, but she was present in a way that felt structural, the way a good foundation feels not because you can see it, but because the building above it doesn't shift. She had a partner, Detective Ray Suarez, who was younger and quieter and who handled the technical aspects of the investigation with the concentrated patience of someone who found complexity interesting rather than frustrating. By Friday morning, 12 hours after the call, they had established several things. Diane's phone had last pinged a cell tower in northeast D.C., approximately 4 miles from our house. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse, her keys, and her wallet were on the kitchen counter, which Detective Okafor noted with the particular attention she gave to details that didn't quite fit. A woman taken involuntarily typically doesn't have time to arrange her belongings. A woman who leaves voluntarily might leave them behind deliberately. She didn't say this to me directly. She said, "We're exploring all possibilities." I heard what she meant, and I rejected it. I rejected it not because I was naive or because I refused to consider the evidence. I rejected it because the voice on the phone had been fractured in a way I could not reconcile with performance. I have known Diane for 7 years. I know every register of her voice. The professional register, the domestic register, the frightened Lily is sick register, the genuinely distressed about her work register. The voice on that call was none of these. It was underneath all of them, operating at a level I had only heard once before, when her mother had a cardiac event 2 years ago, and I had answered the hospital's call and driven to find Diane sitting in a waiting room chair with her hands in her lap and her face arranged around the specific effort of not collapsing. That was the voice on the phone. I could not believe it was theater. My mother-in-law, Rosa Reyes, arrived from Baltimore at 9 a.m. on Friday morning. She was 71, a small woman with Diane's exactness of movement and none of her emotional reserve. Rosa felt everything openly and managed it loudly, which in normal circumstances could be exhausting, and in this one was, strangely, the most honest thing in the room. She held Lily, who was being told that Mommy had gone to help a friend and would be home soon. A lie I'd constructed the night before with the careful inadequacy of a parent trying to shield a 4-year-old from a reality I didn't yet fully understand myself. Lily accepted this with the provisional trust of a child who knows something is wrong and has decided, for now, to believe the adult version. On Friday afternoon, Detective Suarez brought me something. He showed me, on his laptop, a photograph from a traffic camera on Pennsylvania Avenue, time-stamped at 11:23 p.m. the previous Thursday night, 24 minutes before Diane's call. The photograph showed a dark blue sedan stopped at a light. The passenger side window was down. The woman in the passenger seat was Diane. She was not, in this photograph, distressed. She was looking at the driver. I couldn't see the driver clearly. The angle was wrong, the resolution insufficient for the detail I wanted. But Diane's face was turned toward him with a particular quality of attention that I recognized, and which hit me somewhere below reasoning. It was the way she looked at people she was deeply comfortable with. Not romantic, necessarily. She looked at Rosa that way, at her closest friend Meredith that way, but intimate. The look of someone in a space they have inhabited long enough to stop performing. 24 minutes before she called me crying. Who was she with? I asked. We're working on that, Detective Suarez said. That's not an answer. He looked at me with the careful compassion of someone who is managing information and the person who needs it simultaneously. Mr. Cole, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there any reason at all, that your wife might have chosen to leave on her own? I looked at the photograph. Diane, face turned, the intimate attention I knew. She asked me 4 days ago if I was happy. I said. Detective Suarez waited. I said yes, I said. I didn't ask her back. He wrote something in his notebook. That evening, while Rosa put Lily to bed and I sat at the kitchen table with the undergraduate papers I had not touched since Thursday night, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. Mr. Cole, a man's voice, careful and low. My name is Daniel. I think I can help you find your wife. I held the phone very still. Who are you? I know Marcus Webb, he said. I think you should too. The 72 hours following the phone call function as an extreme psychological stress test for Marcus. And what the test reveals is a man whose fundamental orientation toward his marriage has been one of trust so complete it approached the structural. He has not been inattentive or negligent. He has been trusting in the way that people trust load-bearing walls, without constant verification, because the verification was done once, thoroughly, and the wall has not failed since. His rejection of Detective Okafor's implicit suggestion that Diane may have left voluntarily is psychologically precise and deeply understandable. He is not refusing evidence. He is weighing evidence against a 7-year database of intimate knowledge. The voice on the phone is, to him, the most reliable data point he has, because it comes from the body rather than from deliberate communication, and bodies, he believes, don't lie. He is right that bodies don't lie. He doesn't yet know that the body he heard on that call belongs to a woman who has been rehearsing her exit for months. The traffic camera photograph is the pivot point of Part 3, and its psychological weight comes not from what it shows, Diane in a car at 11:23 p.m., but from how she looks. Marcus recognizes the quality of her attention toward the unseen driver not as romantic evidence, but as intimacy evidence, which is both more and less damning depending on what kind of relationship he fears. His response to Detective Suarez's question, "I didn't ask her back," is the first moment of self-implication in the narrative, the first suggestion that the story is not simply about Diane's choices, but about the silence between two people who stopped asking each other the essential questions. Daniel's phone call introduces a new variable at precisely the moment Marcus's certainty about the voluntary versus involuntary question is at its most fragile. The unknown caller, the name Marcus Webb. These arrive as the story's first pull toward the truth, and the dramatic question becomes not whether Marcus will find Diane, but what he will find when he does. Daniel turned out to be 29 years old, a junior associate at a commercial real estate firm in downtown D.C., and he had the specific discomfort of someone doing something he believed was right and found deeply unpleasant. We met at a coffee shop on Saturday morning, 36 hours into Diane's disappearance. He arrived before me, chose a corner table, ordered nothing. When I sat down, he looked at me with the focused anxiety of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and is already departing from the script. "I didn't know what was planned," he said immediately, which told me that something had been planned before he could tell me that he hadn't known about it. "I want to be clear about that." "What was planned?" I asked. He wrapped both hands around a coffee cup he hadn't ordered and stared at it. "Marcus Webb is my boss," he said. "Senior partner. He and your wife have been involved for about 5 months. I found out 2 months ago, not because either of them told me, but because I handle travel arrangements for the firm and I started noticing things that didn't add up." "What things?" "Hotel bookings. A boutique inn in the Shenandoah Valley in September." He looked up briefly. "Restaurant charges. A cabin rental in West Virginia starting last Thursday night." "Last Thursday, the night of the phone call. He reserved the cabin," Daniel said, "for 4 days. In a name I didn't recognize. Not his name, not your wife's name. I wouldn't have known, except I recognized the credit card number. It's a personal card he uses for off-book things. I've seen it before. I absorbed this very carefully. You're telling me they planned this." He nodded, once, the nod of someone confirming something they wish they couldn't confirm. "She called me," I said. She sounded terrified. She said someone had taken her. Something moved across Daniel's face, not surprise, but the specific discomfort of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd feared. "I didn't know she was going to do that," he said. "I swear. I thought she was just going to leave. Tell you she was leaving." A pause. "When I heard you'd called the police, he stopped. "You called me," I said. "I didn't want," he looked at his hands. "There are police involved now. This is different from what I thought it was." "Give me the location of the cabin," I said. He did. I called Detective Okafor from the parking lot. She arrived at my house 40 minutes later with Detective Suarez and a third person she introduced as an investigator from the Major Crimes Unit, a detail that told me the case had been escalating internally in ways I hadn't been fully informed of. They sat at my kitchen table, the same table, the undergraduate papers still there. I hadn't moved them in 36 hours, and I gave them Daniel's information and watched Detective Okafor's face as she processed it. "We were already looking at Webb," she said, carefully, when I'd finished. "Since when?" A pause that measured something. "Since yesterday morning. The traffic camera was the first thing. His plate came back on a different camera, 2 blocks away. We've been building the picture." "Then why didn't you tell me?" She looked at me with the specific compassion of someone delivering information they know will hurt. "Because at that point we didn't know if your wife was a victim or a participant. We needed to understand the situation before." "She's my wife," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." I went upstairs and checked on Lily, who was watching a cartoon in her room with the concentrated seriousness she brought to cartoons she found genuinely narratively complex. She looked up when I came in. "Is Mommy okay?" she asked. "Mommy's going to come home," I said, which was not the same thing as okay. And Lily, who was 4 and not unintelligent, registered the distinction and looked at me for a moment before returning to her cartoon. Detective Okafor and her team drove to West Virginia that afternoon. They found the cabin, a rental property in the Spruce Knob area, isolated, approached by a gravel road that would have made it effectively invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. They found Diane and Marcus Webb at 4:22 p.m. on Saturday, approximately 41 hours after the phone call. I was not there. I was in Capitol Hill with Lily and Rosa, standing in the kitchen pretending to make dinner while Rosa actually made dinner, when my phone rang and Detective Okafor said, "We found her. She's safe." "Safe?" I repeated. A pause. "She was there voluntarily, Mr. Cole. I want you to hear that from me directly before." "I know," I said. And I had known, since the coffee shop, since Daniel's hands wrapped around the empty cup. I had known and had spent 41 hours running both versions of reality in parallel. The version where she was taken and the version where she left, and had not been able to fully inhabit either one because inhabiting either one required the other to be false, and something in me had been refusing to close the circuit. "Is she?" I started and didn't know how to finish. "She's asking to come home," Detective Okafor said. I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and heard Rosa behind me, stirring something, and Lily somewhere upstairs, and the ordinary sounds of my house in the early evening, and I thought, she asked to come home. As if home were a place that still existed in the same form. As if coming back were the same as returning. I had not yet fully understood what she had done. I was beginning to. The chain of causation in Part 4 is elegant in its structural inevitability. Diane's plan to disappear with Marcus Webb required logistical support that left traces, hotel bookings, a recognizable credit card, a cabin reservation, and a false name. These traces were observed by Daniel, who was positioned, by professional proximity, to see them. Daniel's decision to call Marcus rather than remain silent is the single action that collapses the plan, and it comes not from malice or loyalty to Marcus, but from something simpler. Daniel was not prepared for the consequences to be this large. The key causal moment is the phone call Diane made to Marcus. She introduced the element of a staged abduction, presumably to give herself more time, to prevent a clean paper trail of voluntary departure, to avoid the immediate confrontation that a simple, "I'm leaving," would have produced. But the phone call transformed a personal situation into a criminal one. It mobilized police, generated camera footage, produced an investigative record. Every tool Diane used to extend her window of escape became, once law enforcement was involved, a tool for locating her. Detective Okafor's admission that they'd been looking at Webb since Friday morning is significant. The investigation had independently arrived at the truth before Daniel called Marcus. The staged abduction did not create mystery. It created documentation. The very act of performing a kidnapping for the benefit of one person generated evidence visible to an institutional apparatus with far greater investigative capacity than a single husband. Marcus's "I know," when Okafor confirms Diane was there voluntarily, is the emotional center of Part 4. It is not the knowing of someone who suspected from the beginning, but the knowing of someone who has been holding two incompatible truths in parallel and is now watching one of them, finally and irrevocably, collapse. Diane came home on Sunday morning. She came in a car driven by Detective Suarez. Not a police car, just his own vehicle, a gray Civic, which I had not expected and which somehow made the moment more rather than less surreal. She walked up the front steps of our row house in the same clothes she'd been wearing in the traffic camera photograph, carrying nothing, because whatever she had packed for 4 days in a West Virginia cabin had been left behind or taken by Detective Okafor's team as part of the evidence process. I was only beginning to understand the scope of. I opened the door before she reached it. We looked at each other across the threshold for a moment that had no useful unit of measurement. She looked exhausted in a specific way, not the exhaustion of someone who had been through an ordeal, but the exhaustion of someone whose plan has concluded in the worst possible version of itself and who is now facing, unshielded, the consequences they had been trying to avoid. "Lily's with Rosa," I said. "They're at the park." She nodded. I stepped back from the door and she came inside. We sat in the living room, the room she had decorated with the careful layered attention of a woman building an argument about who she was. The wool rug she'd sourced from a small workshop in Vermont. The linen curtains in a particular shade of oatmeal she'd described to me once as the color of a room that thinks clearly. The framed prints she'd arranged and rearranged over 3 weekends until the wall said what she wanted it to say. She sat on the couch in all of it and looked at her hands. "Tell me," I said. "Not explain, not justify. Just tell me." She told me. She had met Marcus Webb in May at an industry event, a design conference where he'd been on a panel about commercial development and public space. She'd introduced herself afterward because she was working on the city park project and his firm had an adjacent development contract. They'd had coffee, then lunch. Then, in July, something she described as crossing a line, in the way people describe it when they've crossed it and are naming it retroactively rather than in the moment of crossing. "Why the phone call?" I asked. "Why not just tell me you were leaving?" She was quiet for long enough that I started to think she wasn't going to answer. "I was afraid," she said. "Of me? Of the conversation?" she said. "Of what you'd say? Of having to sit in this room and see your face." She looked up briefly. "I knew you'd be," she stopped. "Devastated." I said. "Yes," she said, quietly. "And I couldn't. So instead, you made me think someone had taken you," I said. "I called 911. There are police who spent 3 days on this. Lily has been told." My voice stopped working momentarily. I let it stop and then continued. "Lily has been asking about you. I've been telling her you went to help a friend." Something moved across her face that I hadn't seen before and don't have the precise word for. A compound of guilt and grief and something that looked, underneath both, like shame. True shame. The kind that comes not from being caught, but from hearing the consequences of your choices described by the person who lived them. "I know," she said. "Do you?" I said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Because the phone call, that's not something you do by accident. You rehearsed that. You planned it. The fractured voice, the disconnection. You made me believe you were in danger." "I was scared," she said. "I made a terrible decision." "That's not the same thing," I said. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car started and drove away. The house was very quiet in the specific way it was quiet on Sunday mornings when Lily wasn't in it. "Are you in love with him?" I asked. She looked at me. "I don't know," she said. This answer, which might have seemed evasive, landed differently than I expected. It landed as the most honest thing she'd said, because Diane's particular form of honesty was never performed. She didn't say things she didn't mean, and she didn't withhold things she did mean for long. And I don't know from her was not a deflection, but a genuine state of not knowing that she was reporting accurately. "What do you know?" I asked. A long pause. "I know that I've been unhappy for a long time," she said. "Not with you exactly. With the version of me that existed in this marriage. I felt like I'd built something that looked exactly right, and then moved into it, and realized it wasn't." She looked at the room around her, the rug, the curtains, the carefully arranged prints, with an expression that contained a quality I hadn't expected: grief. "I love this room," she said. "I love this house. I love Lily with everything I have. And I couldn't find myself in any of it anymore." "And you found yourself with him?" I said. "I felt like myself with him," she said. "Which is different." I thought about this distinction, found yourself versus felt like yourself. Whether they were the same thing, or whether the gap between them was the most important distance in the room. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. The night on the couch. You asked me if I was happy. I answered. You could have answered too. She closed her eyes. I tried, she said. About 6 times in the past 3 months. And every time I looked at your face, I couldn't do it. Because you were happy. You told me the truth. You were genuinely happy. And I couldn't. So, you decided to disappear instead. Yes, she said. The word was very small. I know how that sounds. I need to know one thing, I said. Was any of it, the marriage, the years, Lily, was any of it real for you? Or was I building something with a person who'd already decided she wasn't going to be there? She looked at me with the full attention she reserved for things that mattered. It was real, she said. Every year of it was real. And then something changed, and I didn't know how to tell you. And I made the worst possible choice. A pause. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not even asking you to understand. I just need you to know that the years were real. I looked at her, the woman I'd met at a dinner party, the woman who'd handed me wine and laughed at my expression, the woman who'd built a room in oatmeal linen because it was the color of a room that thinks clearly. I thought about Lily at the park with Rosa, asking in her provisional, trusting way whether Mommy was okay. You're going to have to tell Lily something, I said, in terms she can understand. She needs to hear it from you. I know, she said. And there are going to be legal consequences, I said. The phone call. The police investigation. Detective Okafor told me. Filing a false report. Obstruction. You'll need a lawyer. She nodded, already knowing this. I need you to go, I said. Not permanently. Not yet. I don't know what permanently looks like. But today, I need Lily to come home to this house without. I need to think. She stood. She looked at the room one more time. Slowly, the way you look at something you might be looking at for the last time. And then she looked at me. I'm sorry, Marcus, she said. For all of it. Especially the call. I know, I said. She left. The confrontation in the living room is the story's emotional and psychological climax, and its most important characteristic is what it is not. It is not a screaming match, not a collapse, not a performance of either rage or grief. Marcus and Diane sit in the room she built and speak with the focused honesty of 2 people who understand that this conversation will define what comes next, and who are both, in different ways, trying to be equal to it. The trigger point that accelerated the collapse was not the affair itself. Affairs, however painful, exist on a spectrum of relationship crises that can sometimes be addressed. The trigger was the phone call. By staging an abduction, Diane transformed a private marital crisis into a public institutional event, and in doing so she foreclosed several of the outcomes that might otherwise have been possible. A husband who discovers his wife is having an affair has options. A husband who has spent 72 hours believing his wife was abducted, who has watched his daughter ask where Mommy is, who has sat with a detective and answered questions about threats and conflicts, is navigating a different emotional landscape entirely. The deception didn't buy Diane time. It spent the relationship's remaining credit. Diane's explanation, that she felt like herself with Marcus, that she'd lost herself in the version of life she'd built, is psychologically coherent without being morally exculpatory. Many people experience the gradual erosion of self in long-term partnership. Far fewer respond by staging a disappearance. The gap between the feeling she describes and the action she took is where the real accountability lives. Marcus's final request, tell Lily something, in terms she can understand, is his most revealing line. In the middle of his own devastation, his first practical concern is the narrative his daughter will receive. He is not asking Diane to spare herself or spare him. He is asking her to show up, in the most essential way, for the one person neither of them is allowed to fail. 5 months later, the legal situation resolved in the way that legal situations involving people with no criminal history and good lawyers tend to resolve. A plea agreement, community service, a fine, a formal record that will follow Diane for years but will not define the rest of her life in the most catastrophic way. Her lawyer was good. Detective Okafor testified to her full cooperation following the discovery. The judge, a woman in her 60s with the exhausted pragmatism of someone who has seen worse every week for 30 years, imposed a sentence calibrated to consequence rather than punishment. Diane was present for every court date. She did not minimize what she had done. Her lawyer told me, afterward, that this had helped, that judges respond to accountability in a way they don't respond to deflection. I believed it. It was consistent with who Diane was, underneath the choices she'd made. A person who, when finally cornered by reality, faced it. We did not reconcile. I want to be clear about this, not because I think reconciliation would have been wrong. I've stopped organizing this story around right and wrong as primary category, but because the specific injury of the phone call was something I could not find my way past. I understood the affair in the sense that I could hold it structurally, trace its causes, identify the silences and distances that had made space for it. I had not asked her back on the couch. I had given her space when she needed conversation. I had been happy in a way that was true but insufficient, and insufficiency over time is its own kind of failure. But the phone call was different. The phone call was the moment Diane looked at the potential cost to me. My fear, my 72 hours, Lily's face when she asked where Mommy was, and judged it acceptable. That judgment told me something about the distance that had opened between us. Not about her character in total, but about where I had come to sit in her calculus. You do not stage a kidnapping for someone whose fear still moves you. We share custody of Lily. 3 days with me, for with Diane, alternating weekends, with the flexibility that two adults who are committed to their daughter can usually manage. Lily is 5 now. She knows that Mommy and Daddy don't live together anymore, and she has the provisional acceptance of a child who adapts to the world as it is because she hasn't yet decided it must be different. She asked me once if I was sad, and I told her sometimes, and she put her hand on my knee with the seriousness of someone administering a clinical intervention and said, "I'll sit here for a while," and did. I am not going to be the father who fails his daughter because her mother failed him. This is the clearest thing I know. Marcus Webb and Diane are not together. I learned this 4 months after the cabin, from Meredith, Diane's oldest friend, who told me with the careful neutrality of someone navigating loyalty to both sides of a fractured situation. The relationship did not survive the consequences, the legal process, the public exposure, the weight of what it had cost. Whether this is justice or irony or simply the unremarkable tendency of relationships built in crisis to fail under normal conditions, I have stopped caring. It is a fact. I hold it without heat. What I have spent the most time with, in the months since, is the question Diane asked me on the couch 4 days before the phone call. Are you happy with us? With this? And my answer, I'm happy. I don't need it to be different. I have turned this exchange over many times, the way you turn a structural failure over looking for the precise location of the break. And what I've arrived at is not that my answer was wrong. I was happy, in the accurate, verifiable sense that I was not suffering, was not dissatisfied, was not aware of a gap between the life I had and the life I wanted. But I had not asked her back. And the not asking had its own meaning, which was, I am not monitoring this. I trust it to hold. Trust is not the same as attention. This is the thing I keep arriving at. I had trusted our marriage with the confidence of an engineer who has verified a structure once and stopped checking it, because structures that are built well don't need constant verification. But marriages are not static structures. They are more like living systems. They require ongoing attention, regular maintenance, the willingness to ask the question not once, but continuously, to hear the answer not as confirmation, but as data. She had been telling me, in the language of running routes and phone habits and a question on a couch at 9 o'clock, that something was wrong. And I had a framework that organized her signals as something other than what they were, because the framework had been built to trust, and trust does not make space for its own refutation. I am not absolving her. The phone call is not something I can reach through to find some understanding that renders it acceptable. What she chose to do, the fear she decided to cause, the institution she chose to mobilize, the story she told Lily. These are hers to carry, and she carries them, as far as I can tell, without trying to put them down. But I am also not entirely innocent in the distance that made the choice possible. I had been happy while she was disappearing. That is its own kind of failure, quieter and less culpable and much harder to account for. Lily will be starting kindergarten in the fall. She is already concerned about the academic rigor, which is a concern I find both alarming and deeply recognizable. She has informed me that she plans to sit next to someone who is good at drawing because she needs to improve in this area. She has a plan. She is her mother's daughter in this, and I love her for it without qualification. Last week, she asked me to show her how to read a map, a real paper map, the kind with topographic lines and elevation markers, which she'd seen in an illustration in a book and become immediately interested in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the undergraduate papers long since returned and reaccumulated, and I showed her how the lines that were close together meant steep ground, and the lines far apart meant something gradual, something you could walk across without noticing you were climbing. "How do you know where you are?" she asked. "You find two things you recognize," I said, "and then you figure out where you must be between them." She studied the map with the focused seriousness she brought to things she'd decided to understand. "And if you don't recognize anything, then you pay closer attention," I said, "until you do." She accepted this. She spent another 20 minutes with the map, locating landmarks, triangulating positions, asking questions I answered as honestly as I could. And I sat across from her in the morning light of our kitchen, in the house that is ours now in a different way than it was, and I thought, this is what remains. Not the version of the future I'd built and believed in, but this, a child learning to locate herself in the world, a father who is still learning the same thing, a kitchen table between them that holds. It will have to be enough. And some days, more days than I would have believed, 5 months ago, it is. Diane's staged abduction is, at its core, an extreme expression of a universal human impulse, the desire to escape a painful truth by controlling its delivery. Most people who need to end a relationship and cannot find the words to do so do not stage kidnappings, but many do disappear in smaller ways, constructing elaborate contexts of busyness, distance, or distraction that defer the confrontation they cannot face. Diane's version is simply more literal, and therefore more visible in its architecture and more catastrophic in its consequences. The deeper meta-theme of this story is the cost of comfort. Marcus was comfortable. He was, in the honest and verifiable sense of the word, happy. His happiness was not a performance or a denial. It was genuine. And yet that genuine happiness had made him, over time, less attentive to the person beside him. Comfort has this effect. It reduces vigilance, rounds the edges of perception, makes the status quo feel like a permanent condition rather than something being continuously created and maintained. Marcus trusted the structure and stopped inspecting it, not from laziness but from confidence, and the structure had been quietly failing. The story asks a question it does not answer definitively. How much of what happened was Diane's failure, and how much was the failure of a marriage that had stopped asking itself the essential questions? This is not moral relativism. The phone call was wrong, fully and without redemption, but it is an honest acknowledgement that the conditions for betrayal are almost never created by the betrayer alone. Silence has co-authors. What Marcus is left with, the map exercise, the kitchen table, the daughter who wants to know how to find herself in unfamiliar terrain, is not resolution but orientation. He has lost the version of his life he believed in and found, in its ruins, the materials for a different one. This is not triumph. It is the more modest and more durable achievement of a person who has survived something and chosen, deliberately, to keep paying attention. The map, in the final scene, is not accidental. Finding yourself requires 2 reference points and the willingness to locate yourself honestly between them. Marcus is still doing this work. So, in a different way, is Diane. The difference is that Marcus has stopped mistaking comfort for safety and has started asking the questions before someone else forces him to.